Welcome to CAREX Canada's Outdoor Air Exposures webinar. The objectives of today's webinar are first a brief introduction to the CAREX Canada project, who we are, what it is we're trying to do, followed by an overview of our environmental exposures program and methods. The focus of today's webinar will be presenting our environmental risk indicator results for outdoor air exposures, and we will also discuss additional tools and resources that are applicable to this topic. Let's start with a brief introduction and history of the CAREX Canada project. CAREX Canada is a national carcinogen surveillance program funded by the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer, CPAC, in 2007 as part of their primary prevention efforts. CAREX Canada is led by a multidisciplinary team of researchers based at Simon Fraser University's Faculty of Health Sciences, the University of British Columbia's School of Population and Public Health, and the Spatial Sciences Research Lab in the Department of Geography at the University of Victoria. The team has expertise in epidemiology, occupational hygiene, risk assessment, environmental quality, geographic information systems, and knowledge translation and exchange. The name CAREX stands for carcinogen exposure, and the goal of CAREX Canada is to develop and implement exposure surveillance methods for a range of known and suspected carcinogens. CAREX Canada includes an occupational component that builds off the original CAREX project developed by IARC and the Finnish Institute of Occupational Health, as well as a non-occupational environmental component. This environmental component focuses on risk factors such as exposures to chemical and physical agents, as opposed to lifestyle factors such as diet, physical activity, or smoking, for which estimates of prevalence and trends over time already exist in Canada. Funding for the CAREX Canada project was renewed by CPAC from 2012 to 2017 to undertake a knowledge mobilization program to make CAREX information available and accessible for cancer prevention and policy activities in Canada. How does CAREX Canada support cancer prevention in Canada? One way to prevent cancers associated with occupational and environmental exposures and to minimize their societal and economic costs is to reduce or eliminate exposures. However, setting policies and priorities for occupational and environmental carcinogens in Canada is often limited by a lack of exposure data and poor characterization of the health risks arising from these exposures. CAREX Canada addresses this gap by generating estimates of the number of Canadians exposed to substances associated with cancer in workplace and community environments. This makes it easier to identify and target high-priority exposure scenarios for exposure reduction. The information which CAREX Canada looks to identify and provide in support of cancer prevention in Canada includes identifying which carcinogens occur in Canada, both at work and in the community, where exposures are occurring, how many people are exposed, what the routes of exposure are, and if possible, how much people are exposed to. This information allows us to generate our estimates of occupational and environmental exposure, which can be used by other groups for developing prevention strategies for cancer and other exposure-related diseases, for targeting high-risk groups, for determining the occupational and environmental burden in Canada, and for creating new epidemiological studies that further our understanding of occupational and environmental cancers. A bit of information on how CAREX Canada carries out its work. How does CAREX select carcinogens? We select carcinogens based on evaluations made by the International Agency for Research on Cancer, IARC. We include substances that have been ranked by IARC as either Group 1, known carcinogens, Group 2A, probable carcinogens, and Group 2B, possible carcinogens. We prioritize which substances to focus on via a prioritization exercise where substances were first broadly categorized according to their potential for human exposure in the workplace or in the environment. If exposures were considered unlikely to occur in Canada, they were excluded from further consideration, and the remaining substances were more critically reviewed based on their carcinogenicity and other toxic properties, the prevalence of exposure in Canada, and the feasibility of assessing exposure. Where does CAREX get its data? The scope of CAREX Canada does not include the collection of primary data. Our efforts therefore focus on using existing data only. This distinguishes CAREX Canada from exposure surveillance programs that take an active individual monitoring approach, such as the National Dose Registry. Data which are used in our estimates are primarily from provincial and federal governments, as well as from published literature. Transparency is a key aspect of our mandate, so all of our data sources and methods are clearly documented. Finally, is CAREX peer-reviewed? CAREX Canada actively seeks guidance from experts. A national advisory group provided input to the project as a whole, and other advisory groups were formed as needed to address specific components of the project. In addition, CAREX does have several publications which have included peer review as part of the process. That was a general overview of the CAREX project as a whole. Now let's talk more specifically about the environmental approach. At the start of the CAREX Canada project, the environmental team had to determine what methodology would be used to estimate environmental exposures. We knew that we wanted a method that would allow us to compare and prioritize exposures across 5 different exposure pathways: outdoor air, indoor dust, drinking water, and food and beverages, as well as across a variety of different substances. To accomplish this, we decided that we would use indicators for surveillance of environmental exposures. In keeping with the population-level focus of the CAREX mandate, we developed 3 guiding principles for developing indicators. First, the indicators should be based on regularly collected and available data to support ongoing surveillance over time. Second, indicators should consider a range of environmental media, namely the 5 environmental pathways from the previous slide. And the indicators should allow for comparison among substances, exposure pathways, populations, and geographic locations in order to support prioritization and targeted prevention efforts. We adopted a screening-level risk-based approach using potential lifetime excess cancer risk as an indicator. Lifetime excess cancer risk, or LECR, indicates the number of additional cases of cancer that would be expected to occur in a group of people if they are all exposed to a specific known or suspected carcinogen throughout their entire life. The lifetime excess cancer risk approach has been in use for several decades as a screening-level risk assessment. This approach is commonly used to conduct preliminary risk assessments of carcinogens in a variety of settings, including contaminated sites and the development of regulatory guidelines in Canada. We use this method to estimate risk based on national average measured levels in the Canadian environment circa 2006, and we also sometimes estimate risk based on maximum measured levels if they are available. And we are currently in the process of updating our estimates for 2011. As you'll see on the next slides, we adopted this method because we found it worked well for allowing us to compare potential exposures across substances and pathways, and also because it helps to identify where data gaps or issues with data quality exist. And we can recalculate the indicators to look at changes over time. Let's talk a bit about how potential lifetime excess cancer risk indicators are calculated. First, we require some primary information. This includes measured concentrations of the substance in the environment, in this case measured levels in outdoor air. We get measurement data from national databases, published government reports, as well as the published literature. And I'll talk more specifically about where the data for outdoor air measurements come from in an upcoming slide. Next, we need information to characterize our population. For outdoor air, this includes body weight, breathing rates, and the amount of time that is spent outdoors at different life stages. For these population characteristics, we use values from Health Canada that are used for their standard risk assessments. The environmental concentration data is combined with these population characteristics for different life stages to estimate the lifetime average daily intake. This approach then multiplies the average daily intake by a cancer potency factor or unit risk factor. Cancer potency factors are used to estimate the risk of cancer associated with lifetime exposure to carcinogenic or potentially carcinogenic substances. Multiplying these 2 values together gives us our indicator, potential lifetime excess cancer risk. Something else I'd like to draw your attention to is that different agencies may have different published cancer potency factors. So we calculate our risk indicators using cancer potency factors from 3 different agencies: Health Canada, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and the California Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment. Cancer potency factors may vary by agency because they may interpret the underlying health studies differently or may take a more precautionary approach. We calculate risk indicators using cancer potency factors from multiple different agencies to illustrate the range in risk that may occur depending on which agency's cancer potency factor is used, and also because some agencies may not have cancer potency factors available for certain substances. Now let's take a look at the risk indicators for IARC1 known carcinogens based on outdoor air measurements in Canada for 2006. Once again, lifetime excess cancer risk is a number value that tells us how many extra cancers would be expected in a population of 1 million people that is exposed to a substance at a certain level for their entire life compared to a population that is not exposed. Most often, this excess risk is stated as a proportion, for example, 2 additional cases per million people. We present our risk estimates in graphic form to be able to easily and quickly visually compare potential risks across substances. On our risk graphs, the risk level per million people is across the top of the graph, increasing from left to right. Risk estimates based on average measured levels are symbolized differently on the graph depending which agency's cancer potency factor is used. Maximum risk is represented by an X and is based on maximum intake and the highest cancer potency factor. In Canada and the United States, LECRs greater than 1 to 100 per million may be prioritized for additional investigation, either by collecting additional data or more detailed risk assessment. We use a value of 1 per million as a threshold for consideration to prioritize for additional assessment, given the screening nature of the approach. Depending on data quality, substances with LECRs greater than 1 per million may be targeted for more detailed risk assessments, such as those using probabilistic methods to better characterize the range of potential exposures given current measured levels. Similarly, depending on data quality, substances with LECRs below 1 per million may not be important to prioritize for further study, or it may be useful to undertake additional monitoring to better characterize LECRs for comparative purposes. Data quality is definitely a key component of the risk estimates. Let's talk a bit more about the data used for calculating outdoor air indicators before we look at how these results might be used for prioritization. Of the 33 CAREX priority environmental substances for which we calculated LECR indicators, 22 used data from the National Air Pollution Surveillance Monitoring Network, 6 used data obtained through literature review. This included radon, asbestos, and 4 pesticides, and 5 of the substances are not present in outdoor air, and these substances are chlorination byproducts. Information on the data used for each substance and environmental pathway can be found under the Data tab in the Environmental Estimates section of our website. This example shows information on the data source for benzene, which is the National Air Pollution Surveillance Monitoring Network, or NAPS, operated by Environment Canada. Typically, data from the NAPS monitoring system are of high quality in terms of instruments used and their calibration, regularity of sampling intervals over an entire year, and the geographic distribution of stations across Canada. The network was established in 1969 to monitor and assess the quality of outdoor air in populated regions of Canada. It is managed with a cooperative agreement between the provinces, territories, and some municipal governments, and it includes 286 sites in 203 communities across all provinces and territories of Canada. Not all substances of interest to CAREX are measured by NAPS, and those that are may not be measured at every station. In this case, in 2006, benzene was measured at 53 NAPS stations across Canada. Under the Data tab, we provide not only references to our data sources, but also the actual data which we referenced and used for our estimates. In this case, the average and maximum risk indicators are calculated based on these average and maximum measured concentrations. For other substances that we did not have NAPS data for, we obtained information on outdoor air levels from peer-reviewed published literature or government reports. For these substances, the Data tab will provide information about the studies which we found and the data on measured levels which they reported. We provide a data quality ranking for all the data which we use in our estimates. This example shows the ranking system which was used for data found in the literature. The most highly ranked data is that which is Canadian, collected since the year 2000, and for a sample duration of 24 hours or longer. Data quality ranking becomes lower as we have to resort to studies which were collected in other countries, if it is less than 24 hours in sample duration, or if it has started to become dated. Information on data quality is found under the Data Quality tab. The reason I'm focusing so much on the data and data quality used for our estimates is because they reflect how representative we believe the measurements are of the average measured levels for the Canadian population and the confidence that we have in our resulting risk estimates. For example, here I have compared the data quality ranking for asbestos and benzene for outdoor air. Data quality for asbestos is ranked as very low. Asbestos is not regularly measured in Canada or the US. We only identified one Canadian study from 1984 which measured asbestos using a suitable method for us to calculate potential lifetime excess cancer risk. Our estimates of asbestos levels in outdoor air are based on a comprehensive study from the US which was conducted in the 1990s. Therefore, we have ranked the data quality for this substance and pathway to be very low. Contrasted to benzene, which we have ranked as high because it is regularly measured at 53 NAPS monitoring stations across Canada using accepted protocols. Not all the substances which have NAPS measurements for outdoor air are ranked as high quality. Some are ranked lower depending on the number of stations and completeness of annual data. Now let's go back to the risk graph for outdoor air and talk about possible ways we think it could be used for prioritization. Substances of lower priority might be those where potential lifetime excess cancer risk indicators are less than 1 per million with moderate to high data quality. This might include the substances arsenic, benzoapyrene, cadmium, nickel, and TCDD. Although these substances might be lower priority given their estimated risk level and data quality, ongoing surveillance could be used to observe whether measured levels and risk increase or decrease over time. Substances that might be priority for possible data collection are those which have very low to low data quality and potential risk greater than 1 per million, or if there are any substances with insufficient data. So this might include asbestos and diesel engine exhaust. An additional substance that might be a priority for data collection but of lower priority is hexavalent chromium. Although the risk estimates are below 1 per million, the data quality for this estimate is low. Additional data could confirm whether the concentrations used to estimate risk are representative or not. Substances that might be a priority for toxicological or epidemiological research might be those where there is disagreement in cancer potency factors, where a factor from one agency may indicate risk levels above a threshold, but that from another agency may not. Additional research or epidemiological studies to better understand the dose-response relationship of a substance might create more consensus among cancer potency factors between agencies. Substances this might apply to include asbestos, benzene, 1,3-butadiene, and formaldehyde. Substances that may be priority for local exposure or risk assessment might be those where there is a large difference in risk indicators between average and maximum measured levels, like asbestos, for example. Studies suggest that asbestos is ubiquitous in urban environments and therefore average levels may generally be similar across Canada, but there are definitely more localized places in Canada where we can expect to see much higher concentration levels. Our data review summaries may be a good place to start when beginning to look for local Canadian studies, as we have already identified many Canadian studies with measured levels. And finally, substances that may be priorities for more detailed risk assessment are those with moderate to high data quality and potential risk greater than 1 per million. This might include benzene, 1,3-butadiene, formaldehyde, and radon. Note that radon is not present at significant levels in many regions of Canada, given the geological nature of the source. This risk estimate should be interpreted as applying to those regions known to have potential for higher levels of radon. This discussion of using the risk estimates for priority setting has focused on IARC-1 substances only, which includes 12 substances. We do have outdoor air risk estimates for an additional 16 substances that are ranked by IARC as 2A or 2B substances, that is probable and possible carcinogens. The same prioritization actions may be relevant for these additional substances, but at a lower priority than the IARC ones listed here. This graphic summarizing the indicators for outdoor air contains a lot of information. It allows us to easily compare potential risk across a variety of substances, while also considering data quality and variations in risk depending on cancer potency factors. Sometimes it might also be useful to put estimates from one environmental pathway into context by comparing risk levels to another environmental pathway. For example, compare the outdoor air risk graph to the equivalent graph for indoor air. Although lifetime excess cancer risk estimates for a number of substances in outdoor air are above 1 per million, they tend to be lower than those for indoor air when considering the same substances. In some cases, this is due to lower outdoor ambient concentrations, but it is also influenced by the much larger amount of time spent indoors over a lifetime. Note also there are a lot more data gaps for measurements of substances in indoor air, as more research effort and national monitoring has focused on the outdoor component. The same types of graphs are also available for dust, drinking water, and food and beverages. I would also like to highlight that we have the risk graphs available for individual substances, which allows for comparison of potential risk across the 5 environmental pathways. This is an example for benzene. Again, it includes the same information as the previous graphs, but now it's just rotated by 90 degrees. The risk-based estimates we've just been talking about are based on national Canada-wide average measured levels. You might be asking yourself, what about regional variation? To better understand the regional patterns in outdoor air concentrations of known or suspected carcinogens, we have developed national outdoor air models estimating concentrations across Canada. This example shows predicted annual average concentrations of benzene in Ontario. We have both national and provincial maps available. Outdoor air models are available for 22 substances for the year 2006, and we are in the process of updating them for 2011. The models estimate concentrations for residential locations either using land use regression modeling or levels from the closest NAPS monitors, with additional estimates of concentrations from known emitters. The residential locations are represented by the geographic coordinates of all street blocks in Canada for 2006 from Statistics Canada. This means that we can estimate the population living at different concentration levels. For example, supplementary tables to the model maps show how many people live at different concentration levels both above and below the average concentrations, provincially and nationally. The average concentration level is represented by the line down the middle of the table. In this example, 63% of the Ontario population lives at above average benzene concentrations in outdoor air in 2006. We can also consider risk associated with the different concentration levels from the previous table. This information is normally below the table and shows the range of risk for each concentration level depending on each of the 3 agencies' cancer potency factors. Depending on which agency's cancer potency factor you consider, the Ontario population with potential lifetime excess cancer risk greater than 1 per million from benzene in outdoor air might be 63% using Health Canada's cancer potency factor, as only risk associated with concentrations above average are greater than 1 per million, 100% using California's cancer potency factor, as the risk is greater than 1 per million even at the lowest average benzene concentrations estimated in Canada, and 94% with the US EPA's factor, as it falls somewhere in between that of Health Canada and California's. The screening level risk-based approach used by CAREX Canada for its environmental estimates is similar to work that has been done elsewhere. For example, the US EPA National Air Toxics Assessment Program, or NATA, although there are some slight differences between the two methodologies. NATA characterizes cancer and non-cancer health effects from inhalation of outdoor air only. It combines a very detailed national air emissions inventory with the dispersion model to predict outdoor air concentrations for each US Census tract. And because it does not use standard data for all US Census tracts, as it may have very detailed data for one tract and only coarse data for another, the risks between areas cannot be compared, nor can they be used to track trends over time. As for the CAREX Canada environmental exposure approach, CAREX Canada focuses only on characterizing cancer risks, using average annual or maximum measured levels in outdoor air, as well as indoor air dust, drinking water, and food and beverages. Unlike NATA's approach, CAREX Canada chose to use modeling techniques based on data that is available for all areas of Canada, making it comparable over space, as well as updatable and capable of looking for trends over time. However, neither the NATA or the CAREX approach can be used to identify individual exposures or hotspots smaller than urban regions. Let's talk specifically about some of the strengths and limitations of the CAREX environmental indicators. Strengths of the indicators are that they allow comparison across exposure pathways and substances. They will go up or down directly as measured levels change, which means that we can track progress and look at trends over time. And they highlight important data gaps. Limitations of the indicators are that they assume exposure to average measured levels every day over a 70-year lifetime. This is not a real cancer risk, as it is unlikely to be true for any single individual or group, since people do not typically stay living in one location their whole lives, and concentration levels will vary from average levels throughout Canada. They assume that all of the substance inhaled or ingested is bioavailable, which may not be the case. There may be uncertainty about the measured levels used in the CAREX estimates. The estimates are based on average measured levels, which may not reflect the true values that exist in certain regions. There may be more local data available, which could be used to characterize a region instead of using CAREX national averages. There is also uncertainty around the cancer potency factors used. Cancer potency factors may have been developed from animal studies or occupational settings, which may not reflect what actually is experienced by most Canadians from levels present in the environment. The cancer potency factors used here assume a linear dose response with no safe threshold of exposure, while the real relationship between dose and number of cancers may not be linear. To address some of these limitations, we have developed a tool called eRisk. eRisk is a Microsoft Access-based application and supporting manual that was developed to calculate potential lifetime excess cancer risk due to the inhalation or ingestion of different known and suspected carcinogens in the environment. This tool makes it possible for users to explore our data, change any calculation parameter to see how the results would change, and also to use more locally representative data if available, given that we have used only nationally representative levels. This is what the eRisk tool looks like. It consists of a number of different steps where the user can either choose to open and explore the existing CAREX project's estimates, or they can choose to start a new project and populate it with their own data. Once the necessary information is entered into the tool, it can then be used to calculate a report with lifetime excess cancer risk estimates. We do have an entire webinar dedicated to the eRisk tool, but I just wanted to show a few slides demonstrating how someone might use the eRisk tool to enter their own outdoor air concentration data. In step 1 of the tool, I have specified that I would like to start a new project. I have named this project Arsenic Outdoor Air, and as I have entered into the description, I will be using NAPS data from Abbotsford, BC. Also note the option here, where users have the option to enter their own cancer potency factor in addition to the cancer potency factors already included in the eRisk tool from the 3 different agencies. Step 2 of the tool is where life stage characteristics can be parameterized. The CAREX estimates use the same values as Health Canada for their risk assessments. However, a user could change any of these parameters if they desired, such as the amount of time spent outdoors or the inhalation rates by different life stages, for example. Step 3 is where environmental concentration data can be entered by pathway. Here I have entered a value for the average concentration of arsenic in outdoor air in micrograms per meter cubed. I have entered a note about my data source at the bottom. This data came from the NAP's Abbotsford Airport Station, and it is the annual average concentration measured in 2006. And now I have entered all the required information to calculate the risk indicator based on this scenario for outdoor air. The risk report displays the lifetime excess cancer risk values calculated based on the information which was input into the tool. In this case, the tool had cancer potency factors available from Health Canada, the US EPA, and California. If I had chosen to use a custom cancer potency factor, estimates from this factor would also have been provided here. And these results are based on these cancer potency factors multiplied by the average lifetime daily intake of arsenic in outdoor air, which was based upon the life stage characteristic information and outdoor air concentration data which I input into the tool. In this example, the risk indicators are less than 1 per million but vary depending on the agency. Here is a table off the website which reports the national risk indicators for arsenic. Risk estimates based on the Abbotsford measurements are higher than those based on national average measured levels. If you are more interested in the eRisk tool, please see our additional webinar dedicated to this topic. I would like to take the last part of the webinar to overview some additional tools and resources that CAREX has to offer, but before I do that, let's just recap on what's been presented so far about the environmental indicators and outdoor air exposure estimates. CAREX Canada uses a screening level risk-based approach which uses indicators for surveillance of environmental exposures. The indicator we have chosen to use is potential lifetime excess cancer risk. We chose this indicator for several different reasons, one being that it allows us to compare and prioritize across different environmental pathways. In addition to outdoor air, pathways for which we estimate risk include indoor air, indoor dust, drinking water, and food and beverages. The indicators also allow us to compare across substances. We have calculated environmental risk indicators for 33 different substances. The estimates are based on national average measured concentrations circa 2006. For outdoor air, the main data source used is the National Air Pollution Surveillance Monitoring Network, and we are currently updating our estimates for 2011. To explore regional variations in outdoor air concentrations and associated risk levels, we have developed national outdoor air models for 22 different substances, which are also being updated for 2011. And we have also developed the eRisk Lifetime Excess Cancer Risk Calculator tool, where users can explore the indicators in more detail, change parameters to compare different scenarios, or use their own local or regional data. The environmental risk indicators can be used for priority setting. Agencies and organizations have different mandates and roles in how they contribute to cancer prevention and reduction, and this presentation overviewed some of the different ways we think the indicators can be used in support of different prioritization activities. This slide presents a summary of that information, suggesting what might be higher or lower priorities. For instance, at this time, based on the available data of the 2006 estimates, higher priorities might include those substances with LECR estimates greater than 1 per million, the substances benzene, 1,3-butadiene, formaldehyde, and radon in certain geographical areas are potential candidates for more detailed risk assessment based on their risk levels and higher data quality, whereas asbestos and diesel engine exhaust are important data gaps where additional research or monitoring would be beneficial. We see the risk indicators that we've developed as a useful starting point to help guide more focused data gathering and exposure assessment work where identified gaps exist, and to support regulatory process and public outreach when reasonable evidence exists that known carcinogens are present in the Canadian setting at levels sufficient to be of potential concern. And we are currently in the process of recalculating our indicators for 2011 and will soon be able to provide an update to this table based upon the newest information since 2006. Now let's talk about some of the additional tools and resources that are available. Another tool developed by the Environmental Exposures team is the Emissions Mapping Project, or EMP. During our process of developing environmental indicators, we found there was a lot of information about emission sources and levels in outdoor environments, which we used to develop this tool. One of the main objectives of the EMP is to develop an indicator of environmental quality for different regions in Canada, and using indicators be able to generate comparable exposure profiles for regions based on their total toxicity of emissions to air for 2006. The Emissions Mapping Project is a web-based knowledge repository that uses Google Earth as an interface to synthesize existing spatial data on emissions of known and suspected carcinogens in the outdoor environment. Certain groups of Canadians rely on the outdoor environment and may not want or be able to avoid exposures. For such groups, exposure reduction does not mean avoiding the environment, but returning or keeping the environment in pristine condition. So this awareness and understanding of environmental quality is critical. We developed this tool to assist policy and decision makers working in environmental health and outdoor environmental quality to learn more about sources and concentrations of known and suspected carcinogens in the Canadian environment. The Emissions Mapping Project ranks different regions based on their total toxicity of air emissions in 2006. This example shows the provincial ranking file. Key questions the ranking file can begin answering are: which substances are released to air in my region? How toxic are they? How does this compare to other areas? What are the main sources? And tell me more about this pollutant. We have additional Google Earth files available that can be overlaid on the ranking files, as you can see here with the extruded points displayed on the provinces. These additional files help to answer questions that may arise from viewing the ranking files, such as where are the emitters of selected substances located? Who is emitting and how much? What about industrial emissions to water and land? What other sources might be emitters? And what levels have been measured here? Let's illustrate by looking at Ontario in greater detail. Ontario was ranked second out of 13 provinces and territories for total toxic emissions to air in 2006. Clicking on a region in Google Earth provides a pop-up box with more information about emissions within that region and how it compares to other regions. Looking at the ranking file in more detail, the first column of the table lists all the substances which are included in the ranking file, followed by their estimated annual amounts of emissions in kilograms in the second column. Column 3 contains toxicity factors, which indicate how toxic a substance is relative to a reference substance, in this case benzene. This is used to convert annual emissions into toxic equivalent emissions in column 4, which we can add together or use to compare emissions between substances. The last two columns of the table show how a particular region ranks based on levels of a substance compared to all other regions that also have that substance. Based on toxic equivalent amounts of emissions in kilograms, the fourth column in the table, the three highest amounts of toxic equivalent emissions in Ontario were arsenic, lead, and benzene. To learn more about the emissions of a particular substance, we can click on the total annual emissions, the second column in the red font, to see the sources. This will bring up an additional substance-specific table with source information. The main sources of the substances with highest toxic equivalent emissions in Ontario were industrial emitters for arsenic, residential oil and gas heating for lead, and vehicle traffic for benzene. The substance-specific source table displays the relative amounts of emissions from sources that are included in the rankings. As you can see here for arsenic in Ontario, the majority of emissions from industrial emitters, with lesser amounts from airplanes taking off and landing, residential wood burning, and minor amounts from incinerators and trains. The three largest arsenic emitters in Canada in 2006 were located in Saskatchewan, Ontario, and Quebec. The arsenic emitters to air are displayed on this map as the red points. The Ontario Vale Inco Copper Cliff Smelter Complex had the second highest amounts of arsenic emissions. If we click on the highest point in Ontario, we get a pop-up box window with information about the emitter. Another example referring to our city ranking file, Sudbury is one of the highest ranked of all major cities in Canada in terms of toxic equivalent emissions to air in 2006. This is calculated based on emissions within 25 kilometers around Sudbury. You can see the ranking graph here for Sudbury with a distribution graph at the top. The red dot shows how Sudbury ranks compared to all other major cities in Canada. And we could explore the ranking file and source tables for Sudbury in the same way that we just did for Ontario. In addition to cities and provinces, other regions which we have developed ranking files for include watersheds, health regions, and ecozones. Note that a high rank in the emissions mapping project does not indicate a high health risk. The EMP tool cannot be used to make a direct connection between ambient concentrations and potential intake. Users should refer to the main CAREX risk estimates for information on measured levels in the Canadian environment and potential health risks. The EMP complements our risk-based approach by allowing users to learn more about the presence of known or suspected carcinogens in the Canadian environment, what their major sources are, and which regions may be priorities for prevention or reduction efforts. We also offer resources and training that allow users to create Google Earth files with their own data to display along with our ranking and other Google Earth files. That's a very quick look at the emissions mapping project. We have an entire webinar dedicated to the EMP if you are interested in more information about the tool, the data it uses, and how the emissions and ranks are calculated. Additional resources that may be of interest include our website, www.carexcanada.ca. The website is the main repository for all of our estimates, documentation of methods, and data. The website houses our carcinogen database, where you can access substance profiles and environmental and occupational estimates for our 72 priority substances. I just mentioned substance profiles. These are a great resource for more information about the priority known or suspected carcinogens selected by CAREX Canada. These profiles are technical summaries of information pertaining to each substance and were created to address a noted lack of Canada-specific information on chemicals. The headings listed here indicate the type of information that is included in the substance profiles. We offer additional webinars, both live and recorded. Under the Tools and Videos section of our website, you will find webinars that take an in-depth look at the environmental estimates, the emissions mapping project, as well as the risk-based approach and e-risk tool. Whenever we put on a webinar, we record another version to be made available on our website, so you can come back and watch it again at any time or forward it on to any other colleagues that might find it of interest. We are also able to develop and tailor webinars for specific groups if there is interest within your agency to have its own webinar. There are also shorter tutorial videos in about 6 to 10 minutes in length on our website, which are useful for quick reference as a guide for understanding the lifetime excess cancer risk graphs, reading the provincial tables and maps, or using the e-risk tool. A new set of resources that we've recently begun developing are what we are calling package summaries. These are summaries of CAREX Canada results tailored for various audiences. For example, we've developed 2 environmental prototypes that are organized by exposure pathway, one for outdoor air and one for indoor air. Thank you on behalf of the CAREX Canada team. We're always interested in expanding our network of CAREX knowledge users. Some ways you can interact with us further are by visiting our website, signing up for our e-bulletin mailing list to get the latest webinar updates, along with updates about our data, tools, and collaborations. And you can also follow us on Twitter to get links to CAREX news, as well as resources and articles on carcinogens in the news.